Resilient Showcase project. Within that, we are going to highlight or showcase 3 properties that have been flooded and give examples of what can be done to make them more resilient to flooding. So today we're at Botcherby Community Centre. Now the community centre, we're 19 months on, has been more or less put back, but it has no form of property flood products fitted, and it hasn't got a flood resilient kitchen. So today I've got surveyors with me who will survey the property just to see what appropriate products would be needed, and we're asking them to think outside the box, not just the bog standard products, but take in the whole area and think what they can do that's innovative to reduce the impact a flood will have. So let's go and talk to the surveyors. I'm with Ian Gibbs, who is a surveyor for Cunningham Lindsay, and he surveyed the kitchen in the community centre to make it resilient to flooding. So what have you found and what are your thoughts at the moment?
Right, Mary, what we've looked at is what's existing construction, and most of it's solid walls, which is fine. That's quite easy to be made more resilient. But there's 2 walls, all here, a cupboard, and a wall here that goes into the main room over there, which has got plasterboard. Now, plasterboard tends to be replaced in a flood situation, certainly in a deep flood. So what we would do is we would take down that wall there, that's a section of it, it's the height we're going to waterproof, and the same where the units is there. So what you'd end up doing is put a solid wall back. So you'd have solid walls all the way around and a concrete floor. Other things we have to think about is services and electric. So there's an electric heater there which we need to remove. There's also electrics that come from next door at low level, so we can't have them affected. So what we do is from the meter cupboard we drop the electrics through and down into the sockets. Then basically everything up to this sort of height would be waterproofed and tiled, so it's a clean surface. So we'd have like almost an indoor swimming pool. So water comes in through the door because we're not keeping it out, and then you'd be able to decontaminate, wipe down the surfaces, and the actual structure would be fine. Obviously we've got to put a kitchen in, that's one of the things we're going to do, and there's a stainless steel unit that we're going to use, it's a very resilient kitchen, and we can slot that under there, and therefore they keep their cups and crockery and things, and then you just pull it out and decontaminate afterwards. And obviously the rest of it will be designed to suit.
Just a question, what kind of adhesive and grout would you use in this situation?
Yeah, good question, mate, because what we need to make sure is what we put down won't need drying. Decontaminating but not drying, so we use waterproof grouts and waterproof adhesive, and that means we're very confident that tile will stay down in a flood. Yeah, it's interesting you raised that.
That's great. Right, and that's it. That's all we're going to ask, but we will follow this story through and we will film it to its completion, so you will see what you've suggested come to life, which will be very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Mary.
So Ian, you've called me out to discuss these air bricks. So what do you think about the air brick here?
Well, the problem we have is when low-level floods come along, then the brickwork's quite impervious, modern brickwork, to water. But as soon as you've got a hole, obviously the water's going to get in. So you have to deal with all the holes where pipes go through, or here where we've got an air brick, which is beneath the modern floor. So what you have to do there is put an automatic air brick cover. So what happens is as the water rises, there's a flap in it and it basically automatically shuts. And what that does, it stops the water getting into the building. So it's very simple, don't need to come out and do anything, and it just helps protect your building.
So really we're using the water is actually working with the technology to close it. So
really clever.
Flood warnings always come at 3:30 in the morning, says she with feeling. People won't have to come and put an air brick cover on that. This will automatically shut itself. And as the building's got quite a few, that's an excellent way forward. And they're only, what, tens of pounds really, aren't they?
They're quite cheap, and removing it can be done, the existing one could be done easily with a builder that's got just basic knowledge of construction, and put it back in, and they look very similar to the ones that are on there. So yeah, no problem at all.
No brainer, really.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, I'm with Helen Fisher, who is the manager of Botcherby Community Centre.
What was the devastation like? And we're 19 months on and the community centre's not yet opened. So what's it been like, and how are you sort of thinking about the future should it happen again?
It was a really difficult time for the community and for the staff, because we were all displaced. I came back from my holidays and to complete devastation. We lost everything in the community centre. It's all just ground floor. So, and this is the second time for us as well, Mary. We were hit badly in 2005. So to go through it again was so difficult. And by the time I came back from the holidays, and then there was the Christmas period, all the members and the users, they're all moved, you know, they found alternative venues, they were looked after by other community centres. I think the biggest concern for me, one of the concerns, is getting them back to us, because people settle where they're at. So we've got that challenge ahead of us, but the 19 month that's passed and the reinstatement of the building, it's been just horrific. There's been lots of problems along the way, and we're just pleased that we've got people like yourselves who are here to help us make the building resilient and fit for future as well, because we think that it's not if we flood again, it's when.
Yes, it is when you flood again. Mm-hmm. One thing I'd like to point out, look, is these lovely plastic chairs. So if these get flooded, and they're all sorts of colours, if these get flooded, you can hose them down, sanitise them, and
they'll be
use them
sanitised
again.
and good to go again. Yeah.
And you've been thinking about where you're going to store things higher up, so things don't get flooded and wrecked. And one of the things we are going to be supplying you is obviously a kitchen, but also property flood products that will provide reduce the risk of flooding to the centre. So we'll be thinking about helping you write emergency plans. So should you flood again, should we get a flood warning, you know exactly what you're going to do and what to fit and when to fit it, and that's very important. Yes. Well, thank you very much, and we look forward to filming again as we continue the process.
Thank you. It's really much
Pleasure.
appreciated. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
I'm with Andrew Lynch from Trident BC. He's a surveyor, and he's just done a quick survey of the community centre, and I want to get his sort of generic overall ideas as to what we could do to reduce flood risk to this property. So Andrew, give me your thoughts.
I think there's some very simple things we can do. First off, we've noticed some air bricks in the building in the new section. They could be changed for an automatic air brick which would rise in a flood. Very simple to do, relatively cost effective. Other measures would include our entrance door. We've got a level threshold where we go into the building, a barrier across there in times of flood, which would be removable so you wouldn't see it all the time. It is again a very good idea. In addition, what's sometimes overlooked is repairing the existing building, so repointing, certainly in areas here around the older section of the building. We've got some damage pointing, there's holes through the brickwork where previous services or cables run through. Blocking them up, repairing and repointing, it stops the water getting in. So there's a number of things we could look at here on the actual building that would reduce the risk.
And how about sort of the wider area? Is there anything that could be done not attached to the building, just in the wider area? Just general thoughts.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. Here we've got the benefit of a brickwork boundary wall, and we've got the hill up there leading down to the river at the end there. So what we could do is look at a strategy of trying to use this wall to divert water away from the building. So it would need repairing the brickwork and potentially a waterproof covering to that. We would accept that some water would get into the site, but we'd try and keep the majority out. So repairing the brickwork and then using floodgates across the openings that we put in at time of flood. Other things potentially, we've got a lot of hard standing here in the site. Breaking that up, putting extra drainage channels in, or some more soft landscaping could be a measure that just takes the edge off the peak flow and lets it infiltrate into the
Permeable paving, for instance, in
Exactly,
some
yeah,
areas.
yeah.
Yes, permeable parking.
Exactly.
That's a good
another
idea.
Great idea. So there's a lot of things we can do with the site before it even gets to the building to kind of minimise that risk. So yeah, there's plenty of opportunity at this building.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Harriet from the British Research Establishment, and I'm going to find out a bit more about the Property Flood Resilience Database. And I don't think we're going to use that name again, are we?
We'll call it the PFRD from now.
That's great. So if you could just talk me through it and why there's a need for it.
So this is a sort of online digital tool that we've created, which acts as a database that collects all the information about a property regarding its physical location, its resistance measures, its resilience measures, and all the things in the wider community that can potentially help it against flooding impacts. And from that, it collates all this information and creates a score so that property owners and other people interested in properties can see on a sort of scalar score how well a property is protected.
And will that help eventually with the likes of insurance?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
So
one of the many people that could use it to their benefit.
Yes. So especially at the moment for businesses that don't have the benefit of flood re,
Right.
something like this would be a huge benefit to them.
Yeah, it enables them to see exactly how they're doing and where they could make better improvements. As the tool itself indicates for you whether the sort of ranking of options. So say you were looking at your front door, it could show you which would be the best to have, and you, by selecting which you do have, can see what can be better. So for example, you can say that you don't have any protection on it at the moment, but you'll be able to see that there are better results if you were to select a flood barrier for your front door or a flood door. So it helps people sort of without sort of the background of flood resilience and building knowledge, sort of know what they could do better.
So who's this aimed at?
This is a surveying tool, so it will be available to surveyors to use, but those that would benefit from it would be any stakeholders involved in a property. So that could be the property owner themselves, like myself and you, or insurers, mortgage lenders, or even local councils, just to sort of see what they have in their local area, so they themselves can look at where their resources are needed most.
Right. Do you want to talk me through it?
So on our tool, we have it broken down into the three main elements, which are resistance, resilience, and community. And then behind all of that, we have the property information itself. So that's the actual structure that we're talking about, which will give the underlying sort of backbone for which we then put on these resistance and resilience measures. So property information captures your sort of basic elements, such as whether it's a semi-detached house, a terraced house, all those sorts of things, the roofing style and the building structural materials. In resistance, we look at all the elements that will physically keep water out of a building. So it's resisting the flood. So your doors, your windows, your air bricks, all those possible entry points into your building. Then in resilience, we look at the elements which aid recovery. So that will be your floor finishings, your wall finishings, whether you have installed products such as a sump pump, which will help keep water out, and aspects like that.
And the kitchen, of course.
Yeah, and the kitchen,
yes.
exactly. So whether you've got ceramic tiles on your flooring or whether you've got carpet. So those things which mean you can move back into your property sooner after a flood if the water were to get in. And then community, because this takes into account the fact that you'd have barriers and so on, often in high flood risk areas, and we want to capture that in this as well. Because if your property is sitting behind a 10-foot wall, that's a massive element of flood protection there. So we want to capture that as well. So here we've got things like SUDs, which are sustainable urban drainage, community barriers, and even elements of warning systems. So whether the property owner is sort of linked in with the environmental agency messages, whether they have a local flood warden, or even their own local community group, which will go around and knock on doors. So
or telemetry systems, because you can get community-based telemetry systems
Absolutely.
that will ring people up.
Yeah.
So something like that would be of
So
an
it's all
advantage.
captured a little in this sort of database that was sort of, we're trying to capture all elements of what a property can do to protect itself against flooding. And then we can also look at the position of the flooding. While this isn't actually used in the score, it helps homeowners see sort of where they are in terms of flooding risk and whatnot. So yeah, and we can also attach all the images that we take as we go around surveying.
Oh, wow.
So we can put a lot of context behind this and theoretically write reports on it that could be of use.
And then at the end of the day, it comes out with a score from...
Yeah, so you can see at the top here, I've already started inputting some of the details of the kitchen here.
Yeah.
So this is not finished yet, but a bit like your energy rating scores, you'll get a numerical score which translates into sort of a grade, as it were, like A through to F. A being you're probably living on a boat surrounded by a wall and you'll be absolutely fine, and F being like you haven't got many or at all any measures in place whatsoever. And then we can put in exactly what we could go around and see, but then we can also put in what we would like to have. So for the example of the kitchen, at the moment it's a gutted shell, so we can go in and be like, this is what we can see right now, and then put in what we think would work well. So then we get 2 scores, so we can see how much it can improve on what we have now and what we will have.
That's an excellent tool. It's quite blown my mind. So this will be available, you're hoping to sort of cover the whole of the country eventually. That's the idea, isn't it?
Flood risk areas primarily, and
yes.
It should be available to everyone, but it will be a surveyor-based tool, so yeah.
I'm very excited by that. Thank you very much for sharing it with me. Thank you.
I'm with Stephen Garvin from BRE, and it was his idea to make a house in Watford, BRE headquarters, flood resilient. And so really I've got him here today to help me develop the properties that we're going to make flood resilient and to get as much information out of Stephen as I possibly can. So Stephen, tell me what made you think about the flood resilient house in the very first place?
I think it's quite clear that flooding has been an issue for a long time, and it seems to be getting worse. So every year we have properties that are flooded, they're repaired, and they're put back to the same condition they were in before. So they're vulnerable to damage again. So I wanted to do something that improved that situation. I wanted to create a demonstration that people could come and see, and they could understand how to create a resilient property. And a resilient property that looked good, something that they wanted to live in. And it's important that we educate the industry, both the construction industry and those who manage flood, in local authorities, Environment Agency, and other parts of government. It's also important to create a discussion around this, a discussion around standards and the needs for training and skills in the construction industry and in the flood management industry. And we simply do not have the right level of skills throughout the industry, the right capacity to deliver flood resilient properties, either repairing existing ones that have been damaged, or indeed to build the properties of tomorrow, to ensure that they're not going to be damaged. We're not going to have issues with people being out of the property for months on end, and the costs and the heartache that's associated with that.
Having been flooded myself and been displaced for 9 months, and having supported people who've lived in caravans for up to 2 years post 2007, and obviously some people are still not back post Storm Desmond, then to me this has got to be the way forward.
Yeah, it has to be, and we consider the human impact there, and we consider the cost involved, and both of those are unsustainable. So what we've got a sector here that's been emerging for 10 to 20 years now, as we know, flood resilient sector we could call it. And it's now time to begin to examine that and to look at what the standards need to be. We've all worked in this area for a while, so we know instinctively we need surveyors who are capable of assessing buildings, of coming up with resilient approaches, and being able to discuss that, to explain it to property owners, whether that's homeowners or the owners of properties like the community centre that we have here. Also need the installers, the contractors, and those that are supplying to them, the materials producers, to be better informed and to be able to work to certain standards that achieve the level of resilience that we set out.
Well, thank you for sharing that with me, Stephen, and I'll take you off to the next property now, because that is going to challenge you, I hope. I'm with Andy McHugh, who's been one of our surveyors, and he works for RAB Consultants. So first of all, Andy, would you like to tell me a bit about RAB Consultants and what you do?
RAB Consultants, we are an expert flood risk consultancy, and we specialise in property level resilience. We've carried out 600 plus property level resilience surveys for local authority led schemes, private homeowners through the repair and renewal grants and resilience grants, and also private businesses, including Royal Mail. We also assisted with the development of the Property Care Association's training for flood resilient surveyors, and we deliver day one of the training, and we carry out flood risk assessments as well.
You also do a sort of emergency planning training as well.
Yeah, so we've another arm to the business is carrying out training and exercising for preparing organisations to respond to flooding events, putting them through their paces in terms of emergency roles and development of procedures to enable those roles, etc.
Great. And also you worked with me on a Pathfinder, didn't you?
Yes,
on one of the DEFRA funded Pathfinder projects.
Many years ago.
So we're old mates.
We are.
So Andy, I think I'd like to talk to you about the community centre and your findings of that.
Yes.
Talk about the flood risk and really the problems it faces, bearing in mind that when we went to the community centre it was more or less refurbished. Refurbished in a non-resilient way. We've been left with the kitchen, which will be the most costly bit to replace, and we're going to make that flood resilient. So you've had a look at the kitchen and you've had a look at all the ports of entry and water ingress around the property, and I just wondered what your findings were really, and what you thought and what you would advise me on a way forward.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are still some flood resilient measures that could be considered, as you mentioned quite rightly, the kitchen. So using sort of water compatible kitchen units and whatnot are still available to us. I think on that particular building the focus could be around resistance measures, thereby resistance being keeping water out of the building. And having a quick analysis of the flood risk data that was made available to us, it appears that we could have some fairly significant flood depths there. So any resistance measures that go in are likely to protect against lesser flood risk events when you compare them to Storm Desmond, but ultimately they do provide some protection to the building.
So had they been in place when Storm Desmond happened, the community centre would still flood?
It would appear so, yeah. I mean, the Environment Agency provided us with some sort of outlines and levels following Storm Desmond based on RACMark information. And that sort of suggests to us that that the flood depths in the area were really quite deep, and obviously the community centre manager had reported depths of about 1 metre within the building itself. So flood resistance, largely we are trying to protect against a maximum of 600 mil. So with that in mind, any flood water that exceeds that is likely to enter the building and potentially cause some issues.
Right, so we must, when we're working with the community centre, make sure that they're aware of that, and to use any barriers we might suggest to them, but be aware that in another Storm Desmond then they would flood and to put in evacuation procedures and move things to higher ground.
Yeah, I mean, given the location where they are, they're sort of slap bang between 3 Environment Agency main rivers. You've got the River Petrel, you've got the River Eden, and you've got Durham Hill Beck. And there are flood warnings available for the River Petrel and Eden in the area. So if the community centre signs up to receive the flood warning, then that gives them the opportunity to prepare for flooding, relocate valuables, and evacuate the building should they need to.
And what about the Beck then? There's no flood warning. Would you perhaps recommend a telemetry system so they could be rung up, or is it one of the lower risk
I think my understanding from a quick review of the data is that the actual main risk comes from the River Petteril backing up as a result of the high levels within the River Eden. But the Durham Hill beck itself actually does pose a risk in its own right, but I would expect that the area is covered by a flood alert, which is an alert issued for a much wider geographical area, and my assumption at this stage would be that Durham Hill beck would be included within that.
Okay, right. So the next stage, really, walking around the outside.
Yes.
What would you tell me to do about this?
Well, firstly, my first observation was that the threshold level of the building was a fair bit higher than the local ground level. And looking at the construction of the building, it appears to be a solid floor. So what I was initially looking at was what were the routes of ingress into the building above the threshold level, and basing it all on a 600 millimetre nominal depth. The typical routes of entry that I found were the doorways. Doorways are an obvious way that water can get in, but there are measures such as flood boards or even replacing doors with flood-proof doors that could go in. But there are a lot of lower window sections themselves that are unlikely to be watertight, and so we could look at alternative options there, from sort of re-bricking in those areas and installing new windows, to putting in sort of U-shaped frames, window protection, to protect that as a route of entry. Other routes exist, such as the air bricks. So there are a number of air bricks on an extension to the building, and replacing those with smart air bricks or auto-closing air bricks would seem sensible. And other general routes include wastewater pipes, and through to the actual pointing on the building itself. I think there is certainly scope for sort of repointing sections of the building to prevent that as a route of ingress also.
And if we were thinking about the bigger picture, about perhaps temporary barriers as a solution, now you've had all the data through, do you still think that could be an option? It would be an expensive option.
Yes, things like the barrier deployment. I mean, I'm aware that the Environment Agency have looked at that area of Carlisle and screened the site itself for temporary barriers, and I do think the temporary barriers do hold some weight, but serious consideration needs to be given the warning time, the mobility of the defences, the logistics in terms of how are they going to get to site, who's going to install them, and also where are they going to tie into to ensure that water just doesn't skirt around the outside. But the defences themselves usually protect to about 1 metre, and the estimated depths there for significant flooding events actually exceed 1 metre, and in that sense, then again, you're only really protecting against the lesser significant events.
Yes. Now I'm thinking about the external walls, and also there's a large gate that will go into the car park.
Yes.
So we've got to think about closing that off, certainly. Yes. So what are your suggestions for that?
Well, the use of boundary walls and floodgates to protect buildings should be considered. I think on this occasion there is some scope for installing floodgates within the boundary walls. The only issue that I foresee with that is the actual height of the height and the condition, really, of the boundary walls in their current state. Firstly, in terms of height, if you were putting a floodgate on there, then you could go ahead and put a metre-high floodgate on. But ultimately, the water is likely to just overtop and spill through the railings, because the wall is only about half a metre high.
So it'd be false economy, really?
It would, really. And also, there would be serious question marks about the capability of that wall in its current condition to actually hold back water and stop it reaching the site in question anyway.
So my view of it is your recommendations are, in a lesser flood event, lesser than Storm Desmond, lesser depth, we could put kite mark products up at the doors and all the doors and the air bricks, and really focus as well on an emergency plan. So should the worst happen, so that they don't lose stuff, and also think about where they're keeping things in the building, because if they've got
in fact, I was discussing with the manager about where she's going to stock stuff and placing things like computers. Often people have them on the floor to have them higher up, and everything that matters out of a high flood depth, and have that plan written and in place, and staff trained so they can put that plan into action should the flood warning come.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the development of the plan is definitely a sensible approach. It tells you the who's, the what's, the when's, the how's. One of the points that the community centre manager had made to me was that there were only 2 permanent staff on site during normal working hours. So a consideration would need to be given to the availability and the sort of physical capability of those people to install temporary measures. So because of that, you start beginning to think whether a temporary solution such as a floodboard is more appropriate, or whether a more passive solution such as flood doors to limit the amount of deployment that the community centre will have to do prior to a flood. But yeah, I mean, on your other point, there are numerous simple things that can be undertaken, such as raising various pieces of equipment, you know, as you've discussed, computers, lifting them off the ground so that should the building flood, then at least hopefully the equipment will be saved.
And there's lots of things like A-frames that you can erect and put things on top of them. If they had a sofa, say, that they could get these A-frames and put things up out of harm's way, so they could add that into a plan as to where they were kept. But I think they'd have to get extra personnel in if they got that situation again.
I mean, any more permanent solutions of getting shelves on the walls, for example, and being able to lift things up onto those, I think is a sensible approach.
Perhaps when we get you back, you could talk to them about emergency plans as well, seeing you specialise in that area too. That'd be wonderful. Another freebie for Mary. Thank you. Thanks very much, Andy.
No problem at all.